everybody, it's a new week. We will be doing Unit 9, Notes number 3 this week. So some updates since spring break. So I think the last 2 Mondays ago, I mentioned that the school board was meeting, so they met, so we will be doing distance learning until the end of the school year. I am still updating grades, so make sure that you do your work. You can go back and finish up work that you haven't done. Just let me know if you have made up those assignments. That way I can go back and give you the points for them, because I don't go back and check old assignments once I put them into the grade book. But if you let me know, I will go back and add those points for you. Probably later this week I'll make a video to talk about grading. I think they're still sending out some information regarding how grading for this last quarter semester is going to go. So let's go ahead and get started with our notes. Johnson's Great Society. So now Johnson is president. He was Kennedy's vice president. So something I don't have in the notes but will be included in your assignment for the week is Kennedy's assassination. So President Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. He was making already planning for his re-election campaign. He was in Dallas, or he was in Texas doing different stops. So he was assassinated, he was shot and killed on that trip in a motorcade. He was in a convertible car. And so he died there and then was brought back to Washington, D.C. They had a huge funeral for him. His wife, Jackie Kennedy, had planned everything. And so Johnson was with him on this trip, and so he was sworn in on the plane going back to D.C. And so now Johnson will finish off Kennedy's first term and then will eventually run for president on his own. So Kennedy's murder shocked the nation and destroyed American innocence. The optimism of the 1960s died with Kennedy that day in Dallas. The progress in civil rights, social reform, Cold War was in jeopardy. Now the nation would turn to a drastically different man in office, and that leads to Lyndon Baines Johnson. So a little bit about Johnson, his background. So he was Kennedy's vice president. He gets associated with escalating the Vietnam War and also for introducing programs like Medicare. So Johnson, he was a master party politician. He was also known as LBJ. And was a New Deal Democrat from Texas. He was mentored by FDR himself and knew how to make deals to pass laws in Congress. So he got that name, New Deal Democrat, because he became a congressman. He was a representative during the Great Depression, during that New Deal era. So really looked up to FDR, to what FDR was doing. And you'll see that influence when we talk about Johnson's Great Society. Lots of similarities between the Great Society and the New Deal. He was an activist president who expanded presidential power. No POTUS, President of the United States, had extended the role of the federal government like him since FDR. So he's taking on more responsibility for the federal government. The goal was to improve various parts of the American society in JFK's memory. So he wants to continue Kennedy's legacy and expand programs that he felt Kennedy wanted to accomplish. But reforming America and Kennedy's legacy would require several things. LBJ kept all of Kennedy's cabinet on staff as to continue his legacy. Johnson had to win the election on his own in 1964. Once elected, Johnson proposed his plan, the Great Society. And so we have things to improve in the Great Society. So these are what Johnson wanted to focus on. He would create programs, new laws, new bills that would focusing on ending poverty, helping those that were living under poverty, the environment, helping end pollution, increase conservation, urban housing, making housing more affordable, better immigration policies, education, giving more funding to schools, providing educational opportunities for low-income families, and also expanding healthcare. So the war on poverty. LBJ's first step in the Great Society was to alleviate poverty. So helping the poor would boost the economy and create a stronger workforce. So for a country, if you have a lot of people that are unemployed, if they aren't, being able to afford to basic necessities, housing, food, provide for their children, that's a problem that the country as a whole needs to worry about. So with the war on poverty, he wanted to create resources and new opportunities to try to help people get out of poverty. So in 1964, Congress passed LBJ's Economic Opportunity Act. It provided $1 billion in programs focused on job creation and education for the poor. So sometimes they don't have the right types of jobs. Some of them don't have jobs at all. So it's about finding jobs, creating jobs so people can work and make money, and also educational opportunities, more opportunities for them to go to college, scholarships, grants, so that way they can learn trades and learn skills that will get them higher paying jobs. In 1964, LBJ also signs the Tax Reduction Act. It cut corporate and personal taxes by $10 billion and helped to lead to job creation and greater income for the poor. Healthcare and education. Next, LBJ changed Social Security by creating Medicare and Medicaid. So this would provide low-cost health insurance for the elderly. The elderly was Medicare, so people over, I forgot what the age limit is now, like 65, they can get Medicare. And then also for low-income people, Medicaid provided them health care if they did not have their own health care through their employers, or if they weren't employed and didn't have health care and couldn't afford to pay for health insurance. So both are significant because they are still used today in large numbers. Healthcare is still a huge topic. The idea of universal healthcare, should that be something that everyone gets provided? Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that's something also that was passed recently. And so, like I said, the idea of healthcare and the government kind of taking on that responsibility is definitely not something new. LBJ, he started these programs back in the 1960s, so now it's just about expanding the programs to cover more people, or at least that's the goal. LBJ also sponsored a massive increase in educational funding. He established Head Start and signed the Elementary and Secondary School Act. These programs funded college scholarships, high school textbooks, special education, preschools, and public broadcasting, PBS. So again, just putting more money to schools to make sure schools have the funding that they need to provide for students. Immigration and housing. Hoping to fight discrimination, LBJ signed the Immigration Act of 1965. This act ended quotas based on nationality that had been set since the early 1900s. LBJ aimed to help poor and middle-class Americans afford homes, and so he funded programs to build low-rent public housing for urban poor families. Johnson also created the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This new department to the presidential cabinet would oversee federal housing programs. And so what we see here when we talk about the federal government expanding is that he's creating new programs, making it that it's the government's responsibility to help these Americans. If Americans can't afford homes, let's try to get them, low interest rates. Let's try to find ways so that we can help them, whether it's low rent, lower mortgage payments. So it's the government actively being involved in what's going on in people's lives. Saving the environment. LBJ was the first president of the United States since Teddy Roosevelt to work on environmental protection. Pollution was destroying America's natural wonders and threatening citizens' well-being. LBJ signs the Water Quality Act of 1965. The law required states to clean their rivers. Johnson also signs the Air Quality Act of 1967. This law set air pollution guidelines and let federal government enforce car emission standards. So the ideas of pollution, and while they probably weren't thinking about climate change and that kind of stuff back in the 1960s, they were still aware of pollution and its effect on the environment. So he was definitely being very proactive in terms of trying to prevent further damage to the environment. But the White House wasn't the only branch of the government changing society. The Supreme Court was headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Warren's court had been active in hearing monumental cases in the 1960s. Now the liberal activism of the 60s would sweep through the Supreme Court. Most important were these 4 historic court cases. The Warren Supreme Court. So the court case Mapp versus Ohio in 1961, the court ruled that evidence seized illegally by police couldn't be used in court. So the police need to have search warrants, everything needs to be done properly, or else that evidence cannot be used. Baker versus Carr, 1962, the court ruled that states must reapportion their congressional districts to represent population so that citizens had equal representation. Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963, the court ruled that courts must provide legal counsel to the accused if they couldn't afford a lawyer. So before we look at the Bill of Rights, you have the right to a lawyer, but if you couldn't afford one, then you weren't given one. So this changes that one will be provided to you if you can't afford one. So it creates the need for public defenders. And then lastly, Miranda versus Arizona in 1966. So the court ruled that the accused must be read their rights before being questioned. So that way everyone knows what their rights are. You always hear that being read to people being arrested when you're watching a movie or a TV show. So effects of the Great Society. The power of the federal government had been expanded like never before. Along with that, deficit spending grew and conservative backlash began. And you start to hear from people like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan in terms of their criticism. So with all these programs, they're great, but they come at a cost, because in order to have a new branch of the government, not a new branch, but a new organization, new commissions to oversee these issues, whether it's housing, education, that costs money. If you're building housing, low-income housing, that's costing money. So that is what's called deficit spending. So the government is spending more money to make these changes. And so people become very critical of that. Usually when we talk about conservatives, Republicans, they don't like the government spending this money. They want taxes to be low. They don't feel like this should be the government's responsibility. So that's kind of where you get the differences in political views. So the war on poverty worked. So with those different programs helping job creation, boosting education, the poverty rate was cut in half between 1962 and 1973, went down from 21% to only 11%. The rights of the accused were better protected by law. The Warren Court's rulings guaranteed rights for those innocent until proven guilty. So that's the end of our notes for today. So you want to make sure this week you are doing your raps. You're going to do I'm going to assign you some textbook pages to read and some questions. And maybe I'll throw in another assignment. I'm thinking of maybe assigning a portion of the century to watch. Okay. So let me know if you guys have questions. You can always email me, send me a message on Remind, and don't forget to also check in for attendance.